Welcome all to our second day of this Juris North Kelsen Congress 2021, and thank you all for being there yesterday and for coming back today, and those who are joining us today. We'll be using as yesterday, but the whole weekend, these two hashtags, Kelsen 2021 and Juris North 2021 on social media. What I'm going to do a very brief introduction, and then I will give the floor to my co-host, Gonzalo Rosas at Kiel University in Germany, and he will introduce our first block today with our keynote speakers and contributors. Let me go here. I have to mention, in addition to Gonzalo Rosas at Kiel University, we will be joined later by Dr. Jorge Luis Fabra Zamora. He's in Toronto, at Toronto University. Because of the time difference, he will chair the second block today. And we've been working together on this project for almost a year. We started back in November last year or something like that. Basic rules before we start, especially because we are recording of these sessions to be able to share them later. You are free, the attendees today, you are free to ask any questions you want. You may do that simply by opening your mic and asking the question to our speakers, or if you want, you may write the question or the comment using the chat box, and we are happy, either Gonzalo, Jorge later, or myself, to read them on your behalf. The only thing we ask you, please be very conscious about the time limitations. Especially, I always put myself as an example. I'm from Latin America, we tend to overspeak. So try to keep the comments and questions rather brief, not more than 2 or 3 minutes, because the idea is to have a dialogue rather than a monologue. That's why we have the keynotes and the contributors, give them as well the opportunity to answer your questions and give the opportunity to be mindful of others, to allow participation. And if you want to remain anonymous, you may use your name, a nickname, or simply whatever label you may want to use. Right here, I put my name simply because I am one of many people behind Juris North. For legal reasons, we have many jurisdictions, and in order to avoid any problem, it's simply that's a practical wisdom. However, you may want to share any of our videos in the future. You have complete permission, simply email, you will have the details later, and we are more than happy. Again, I'm one of many people, I'm simply the face today here, putting this introduction. The idea, again, be mindful of others when you ask a question and when you express an opinion. And why these two logos today? I'm going to explain very briefly. Juris North, although I'm talking on behalf of 9 colleagues, including myself, we represent 8 universities. The idea started 7 years ago with Dr. Professor Verónica Rodríguez Blanco, 2 Latin Americans. I'm from Argentina, she's from Venezuela, and we decided to bring a platform cutting across universities. The idea behind Juris North, and we had at the time 5 colleagues, including Verónica and myself, Mike Gordon in Liverpool. At the time it was Peter Cerny in Hull, he's now in Aberdeen. We started with the idea of using the opportunity to create an equal standing or equal footing platform in which we may have senior scholars from political science, from law, from philosophy, and junior scholars coming together in order to have a dialogue. That is why today, as an example, we have our first keynote speaker, Lars Vinx, and the idea we will have an expert and the rest of us simply humans trying to learn from each other. That's why, Lars, be ready, because we are going to ask you, questions, and sometimes maybe very basic for you, but again, the idea is to play this kind of game, different from other discussion groups. The idea is we learn from each other. And that's, again, I'm simply the face, because we moved online last year. We used to have monthly discussions face-to-face in any of our locations. But right now, because of the pandemic last year, we moved online. And that is why we created the roundtables and so on. If we are lucky, the very first event face-to-face will have finally, again, this year will be at Newcastle Law School in December with Amalia Amaya, Mexico University and Edinburgh School of Law. And she will be with us if we are okay with the pandemic situation in December. But in the meantime, we'll continue online. And this is me. I don't have children myself, so I usually work with children or charities or foundations that represent children. All we do at Juris Knows, we do it for free, and all our videos are public access. So if people want to help, I would be more than happy to put you in touch, or simply check their Facebook. It's a foundation in Brazil. We work for children. They've been working with children and teenagers in a very deprived area in Brazil, 60 kilometers away from Rio de Janeiro, for the last 32 years. For Latin America, this foundation was Xuxa Meneghel Foundation. She founded this foundation. They had to change because of the political situation in Brazil. She had to step down. But without giving too much detail. So again, if you are happy to contribute, check their Facebook account. I don't usually put my name, to charities and so on, because different issues, one of them being money laundering. But this one in particular, you can check what we do with the money, where the money is coming from, because everything is online. We are a very transparent organization. And last from me, and I'll probably give the floor to Gonzalo in 30 seconds. We started yesterday, and we'll carry on today with 3 keynote speakers and 4 original paper presentations. And hopefully the idea is to have a book proposal with hard publishing. We've already been working with them for the last few months. The whole event is in memory of 3 dear people to many of us, and in particular to me. Dr. Maria Teresa Lopez, she passed away many years ago. She was my mentor back in Argentina, National University of La Plata, and she introduced me to Kelsen. So my passion to Kelsen, because it's actually a passion, is thanks to her. And then most of our presidents come from National University of La Plata, like Cristina Kirchner and her husband, they both come from this university. Professor John Gardner, again, we all know him or about him. I had the opportunity to meet him more than 10 years ago in a similar event, face-to-face, about Kelsen. So to me, I think it's thanks to Gardner that today we can talk about Kelsen more broadly in the UK. Usually we talk about heart in the UK when we deal with legal philosophy. And it was Gardner, I would claim, I would argue, responsible for bringing Kelsen, to the UK and more, between inverted commas, popular wisdom. If we are lucky, we may have his wife, Jennifer, joining us at any point today. She's very grateful for this as well, keynotes and paper contributors. And last but not least, he passed away recently this year, Professor Eugenio Buligin, as well from Argentina, Universidad de Buenos Aires, Kelsen expert himself in his field, many publications in many languages. And again, all these 2 days and all the roundtables we had so far, in memory of these 3 people, all connected thanks to Hans Kelsen. And that's from me, Gonzalo, and now the floor is yours.
Yes, in this first block, we have 3 main speakers. First, Professor Lars Vinx from Cambridge University. He's going to talk about Hans Kelsen and the crisis of democracy. And after him, we have 2 speakers. We have Professor Jingshu Wang from the University of Political Science and Law from China. He's going to talk about resolve norm conflicts and uphold international law, Kelsen's legacy in contemporary challenges. And Professor Philip Edwards from the University of Manchester. He's going to talk about Kelsen and primitive international law, 3 answers and a question. For Professor Lars Vinx, we have 1 hour, including questions and comments, and we have 90 minutes for Professor Jingshu Wang and Philip Edwards. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Lars Vinx.
Okay, yes, thanks so much for having me speak at this event. I guess I have a slideshow, and I guess I'm going to try to share it on the screen and see if that works.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, good. You can all see this. That's great. Let me start. Good. So I am talking about Hans Kelsen and the crisis of democracy. So as you can see from the title, this talk will not be focused on Kelsen's legal theory, but on his work in political theory. And in particular, I guess the ideas that I'm going to try to work with here are drawn from his most famous book on democracy, the book on the nature and value of democracy that came out in 2 different editions in the 1920s. And so the project of this paper is not really to give an in-depth analysis of all the different topics of democratic theory that Kelsen addresses in his book, but rather to try to show that there's a basic idea in Kelsen about what democracy is that sheds an interesting light on what some people think is the current or the contemporary crisis of democracy. And of course, what I'm going to try to suggest in making this claim is that democratic theorists would do well to take Kelsen's democratic theory more seriously than they do in debating contemporary systematic questions in the theory of democracy. So let me start out by saying a little, or giving a little introduction to what the crisis of democracy might be. So here, I guess I'm going to tell you things that you're all warily familiar with, I suppose. So in recent years, it has been observed by political scientists, several democratic polities are tilting towards authoritarianism. So in the typical global surveys that try to classify countries as to regime form, it has been observed in the course of the last few years that the number of democracies or fully developed democracies is declining, and that many countries that were either seemingly on the way to becoming fully developed democracies or that were fully developed democracies are moving towards or tilting towards some kind of authoritarianism. But this process of regression differs perhaps from earlier periods of democratic regression, for instance, in the interwar period. So what we have today is not that we have coups or we have fascist strongmen take power and then abolish democracy. What we see increasingly in many places is that there are leaders, charismatic leaders who have been elected democratically, but who use the power that they have acquired democratically to compromise the democratic system so as to entrench themselves in power, so as to make it difficult for the opposition, for political dissenters to challenge their power democratically. So the country that I spent a long time living in, Turkey, is one of the prime examples of this, where, of course, President Erdogan, who came into power as a perfectly legitimate democratic leader, has tried to use his power to roll back democracy, or at least to skew the playing field of democracy in such a way as to make sure that he won't ever lose an election in the future. Now, some commentators associate this trend, so a regression of democracy that is not openly anti-democratic, but that often appeals, at least in its rhetorical justifications, to the idea of democracy, with the rise of populism. So the idea is that populism is a political strategy or rhetoric that indicates a perversion of democracy that can threaten democracy. And the question I'm going to be concerned with in this paper is whether this is true, so whether we can indeed say that populism is opposed to democracy or not. And my claim will be that Kelsen has an interest, or Kelsen's view of democracy has interesting implications for this question. So let me start out then by just throwing a definition of populism at you, which is drawn from a book by Kasmude and Cristobal Rubira Kaltwasser, who are 2 leading political scientists in the debate on populism and political science. So they decide, or they say here, that populism is to be defined as what they call a thin-centered ideology. So it's an ideology that can combine itself with a number of other more substantive ideologies, whether they be right-wing ideologies or left-wing ideologies. So populism can come in different ideological flavors. But what unites all forms of populism is that populism considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps. So on the one hand, you have the pure people, the real people, the authentic people, and they are opposed to a corrupt elite that supposedly has taken power and has throttled or thwarted the will or the aspirations of the people. But this, of course, a populist will argue, is an anti-democratic phenomenon, because politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people, where, of course, the people refers to the pure people who are opposed to the corrupt elite. And so, of course, in populist imagination, it is worth pointing out at this point, this corruption that's brought about by the elite is often associated with constitutionalism, with the constitutional restriction of the democratic will of the majority and the enforcement of constitutional restraints on the will of the majority on the part of unelected, democratically unaccountable institutions like constitutional courts, for instance. And so one of the main aspects of the retrogression of democracy that we experience is that populist leaders often assail the independence of the judiciary, and they try to get out from under constitutional control. But of course, the question here arises, it hasn't been answered yet, whether we can really say that populism is anti-democratic, given that it bills itself as a democratic political ideology. And so I have two more quotes here, apologize for this, from Mudde and Kaltwasser to set up the question whether populism is truly anti-democratic in a little more detail. So Mudde and Kaltwasser here give a definition in their book of democracy. They say that democracy without adjectives is best defined as the combination of popular sovereignty and majority rule, nothing more, nothing less. So in fact, the very etymology of the term democracy, the rule of the people, alludes to the idea of self-government of the people. That is, democracy is a political regime in which people, or the people perhaps they should have said, rule. Not by chance, most minimal definitions, so Schumpeter's definition perhaps comes to mind, consider democracy first and foremost as a method by which rulers are selected in competitive elections. So free and fair elections correspond, therefore, to the defining property of democracy. Okay, so I suppose the idea is that, well, the political system is democratic on the condition that there is majority rule and that there are free and fair elections. And nothing more is required for a political system to be democratic. And so, of course, if that is what democracy is, then it seems that perhaps there is no deep conflict between populism and democracy, because populist leaders typically legitimize themselves by appeal to the idea that they represent the majority, which is identified with the true people. Now, of course, the problem is that democracy is often understood in a slightly different way, namely as liberal democracy. So another quote, in most day-to-day usages, Mudde and Kaltwasser say the term democracy refers to liberal democracy rather than to democracy per se. And the main difference between democracy without adjectives and liberal democracy is that the latter, liberal democracy, refers to a political regime which not only respects popular sovereignty and majority rule, but also establishes independent institutions, which are specialized in the protection of fundamental rights, such as, for instance, freedom of expression and the protection of minorities. Now, of course, the question then becomes, well, what is the relation between democracy and liberal democracy? And of course, as you're all aware, there are a number of sort of thorny questions about this. So, is populism inimical to democracy per se, or only to liberal democracy? Now, one way to look at this is what you find in Mudd and Kaltwasser in their book, is to say that, well, liberal democracy is a form of democracy that is even better than democracy per se. So it's a perfected or improved form of mere electoral democracy. And then they go on to argue that, well, populism isn't opposed to democracy per se, but it's opposed to liberal democracy. So perhaps we should say that it is opposed to the best possible form of democracy. So it prevents the realization of the most developed or the most valuable instantiation of democracy. But of course, this argument has an obvious problem. So we are all aware, constitutional theory, political theory, that it's a commonplace that liberalism is at odds with democracy. So I guess look at the debate between Jeremy Waldron and Ronald Dworkin on the legitimacy of judicial review, for instance, right? So it is argued by Waldron that liberalism is at odds with democracy because what a liberal constitutionalist does is to assign the decision on some fundamental questions, how the polity is going to be run, to judges, and that conflicts with the democratic idea that all citizens ought to have an equal say or an equal influence on the law under which they have to live. So it might be argued, it is argued by many scholars, that liberalism is at odds with democracy. Its institutions are counter-majoritarian. They are supposed to somehow restrict democracy's full development, because the liberal sees the full development of democracy as dangerous. But of course, if that's the case, then the populist at this point can come in and say, well, if liberal democracy is opposed to democracy, then to go populist or to build back the liberal element of democracy is really a way to realize authentic or true or full democracy. It's to free democracy from the intrusion of oligarchic control that liberals have anti-democratically imposed on it. So you can't say that populist politics is anti-democratic, and perhaps you can't even say that the constitutional regressions that political scientists have measured are regressions of democracy. Perhaps they are realizations of a more authentic form of democracy. And of course, that's what populist leaders claim. And so that is the populist argument, I guess, that I'm interested in trying to assess. And I think Kelsen can help us to do that. So that is why I think there's a connection between Kelsen and the crisis of democracy. So I think that Kelsen's theory of democracy helps us to show that populism is indeed inimical to democracy, or to democracy per se, and not just to liberal democracy. So Kelsen can show that there's a conflict between democracy and populism that doesn't require us to commit to liberalism. And so the thesis then that I will attribute to Kelsen, or draw from Kelsen, I should say, is that populism is inimical to democracy per se because it undermines the conditions, the background conditions under which majority rule will translate into authentic collective self-government. And of course, I'm going to try to unpack that notion, that phrase, a little bit in the course of the presentation. Now, let us turn then to Kelsen and to Kelsen's theory of democracy. And so Kelsen, like many other theorists of democracy in the interwar period in the German language area, which of course didn't at that point have a long tradition of theorizing about democracy, deferred or appealed to the authority of Rousseau in developing his conception of democracy. So Rousseau was seen by many authors at the time as the theorist of democracy. And so theories of democracy often took the form of interpretations of Rousseau's ideas. Now, Kelsen is interested in a promise that Rousseau's theory of the social contract appears to make. So Rousseau, in the Contrat Social, claims that to live in a democracy, or to be subject to majority rule, is to be subject, I mean, at least given that certain background conditions are fulfilled, it's to be subject to a general will that implements a common good, and not just the factional interest of a particular social group, or of perhaps the arithmetical majority that have won an election. Democracy, according to Rousseau, is therefore freedom preserving in the sense that it assures, or it will guarantee, an alignment between the content of the law and a citizen's interests, or perhaps their considered interests. So the idea here is that Kelsen picks up from Rousseau is that unfreedom in a political context would consist in being subject to laws that thwart your own aspirations, your own interests, your own desires, whereas freedom would consist in being governed by laws to which you give your approval or that are aligned with your own interests or aspirations. And Rousseau claims that, or that's the promise, that in a democracy, the laws will be freedom preserving because they will be aligned with the common good, with the shared interest of all citizens. But Kelsen observes, of course, like many other authors at the time in the 1920s, that democracy, warts and all, as it has come into existence after the First World War in Germany, in Austria, and so on, does not seem to live up to Rousseau's promise. So in the reality of a modern parliamentary mass democracy, the will of the majority seems to impose factional preferences of the largest social group or coalition of groups on others who reject the political programs adopted or pursued by the majority. So as a result, those who are outvoted, they are rendered unfree. They are simply ruled by the preferences of some other social group. And the freedom-preserving character of democracy, therefore, is not, contrary to Rousseau's promise, realized, at least as far as the position of a minority or an opposition is concerned. Now, Kelsen himself, he does not want to challenge that observation or that factual claim about how democracy works. So his project, in a sense, is to see whether Rousseau's promise can be watered down or can be given a reading modest enough to make it conformable to the reality of modern mass democracy. And Kelsen is trying to do that, first of all, by offering an intriguing argument for the majority rule and for the claim that the majority rule is preferable to other rules of collective decision, in as much as it is in the service of our interest in freedom under law. Now, to make this point, what Kelsen does is to compare a number of different conceivable rules of collective decision and of the way in which they impact on the freedom of citizens, understood as alignment of one's own interests or desires with the content of the law. And so the first rule of collective decision that he considers but dismisses very quickly is what I call here a rule of continuing agreement. So this is a rule where, say we want to decide whether we are a group of people, we want to decide how to spend Saturday night, okay? And we might just all agree spontaneously that what we should do is to go to the cinema and watch the new James Bond movie, okay? So we just agree on that because that's what we all want to do, right? And as long as we all agree, we have continuing agreement, and of course it won't be difficult for us to act collectively, to do something together as a group. But of course, continuing agreement will be destroyed or thwarted as soon as someone changes their mind. And the idea is that as soon as someone changes their mind, they are no longer bound. So really what we have here is a condition of anarchy. And Kelsen says, well, law cannot work like this. It must be objectively binding even on those who dissent. And the rule of continuing agreement does not meet that standard. It leaves us exposed to the dangers of the state of nature. So we need some rule of collective decision that will be binding on all, even if someone disagrees with the outcome of the application of this rule of collective decision taking. So consider a second possibility, that's a rule of unanimity. So here the idea is to take a decision, everyone must agree. But once the agreement has been taken, it will continue to bind unless everyone decides that the decision that has been taken unanimously at some point in the past needs to be revised or needs to be deleted and be replaced by a new decision, right? So let's say we all agree that we should go to the cinema and watch James Bond, and half an hour later I see that in the cinema there's another movie I'd prefer to watch, right? I'm bound unless I can decide, unless I can convince everyone else in the group to decide now to watch the other movie. So this rule is objective, as Kelsen puts it. So it does bind those who dissent potentially, and it takes us out of the state of nature. But it has one, according to Kelsen, one drawback, which is that a single person who's been involved in the original decision might acquire the power, the veto power, to frustrate the preferences of a large number of other people. So imagine we are 10 and 9 of us have decided on reflection, we don't want to watch the James Bond movie after all. We want to go into the other movie that strikes us as more interesting. If only one person wants to stick with the decision that's originally been taken, we are all still bound and are forced to comply with it. Okay, so here we have a rule of collective decision that might frustrate the preferences of the vast majority of citizens. The same feature applies to rules of autocracy or aristocracy, right? So these are rules where either one person or perhaps a small group of persons, but not the majority, can decide bindingly for everyone else what is to be done. So I don't know, I might have the authority for some reason to decide for the whole group how we're going to spend Saturday night, right? Now, it might be that I take a decision that you all agree with, and then everyone is going to be happy and freedom will not be impaired. But potentially, of course, it could happen that I take a decision that everyone else rejects, and then unfreedom will again reach an intolerably high level. So contrast these rules then with the majority rule. So this is a rule, of course, according to which we take a decision by majority, and it will remain binding for as long as the majority continues to support the decision that has been taken. But if a new majority arises, I suppose, they can take a renewed decision and revoke or overturn the decision taken by an earlier majority. Okay. So the rule of the majority has one interesting feature that Kelsen puts a lot of emphasis on. He says it guarantees that the preferences of a majority will, at any point in time, will be aligned with the content of the law. Okay, so as soon as there is a majority for revoking or changing a decision, that majority can make that change. So at any point in time, as long as no change is made, we can assume that a majority of people, at least, are guaranteed to see their interests realized in the content of the law. Okay, so the content of the law will align with the preferences of at least 50 plus 1% of the group that is to be governed. So the claim then is, that's the virtue of the majority rule. It's the best approximation to Rousseau's promise that democracy will leave us free under a coercively imposed system of laws that's realizable in the real world of politics. So it's the only rule of collective decision that ensures that a majority of citizens will be free. Okay? No other rule has that virtue, and therefore, in this very, very minimal, thin sense, democracy is protective of freedom, and therefore, the majority rule as a rule of collective decision is to be preferred to other rules of collective decision taking. Now, of course, if this was all the argument that Kelsen offered, there would be, I think, two problems or objections to this defense of democracy and to the freedom-preserving character of democracy. So the first is this. Even if it's true that the majority rule guarantees that a majority of citizens will find their preferences aligned with the content of the law, right? That would not provide the outvoted with any reason to consider the law to which they are subject as a result of majority decision to be legitimate. Okay, so if you go back to Rousseau, you remember that Rousseau says famously in the Contrat Social that if a vote is taken and I find myself among the outvoted, then I just realize that I have been mistaken about what the general will is. Okay, but I have to accept the general will as my own will insofar as I am a citizen. So in being subjected to it, I am not made unfree. Now, of course, there's a very, very long debate about how these claims are to be understood. But the basic idea that Rousseau puts forward is that in a democracy, you might find yourself among the outvoted. And if you do, there must be some way for you to find the decision taken by the majority acceptable or to identify with it or to reasonably defer to it, or to see it as a decision that's taken by a community of which you are a part, okay? And to whose decisions you are bound. And it seems that Kelsen's argument, at least as presented thus far, doesn't really explain how the outvoted could arrive at that identification. So what does it matter to me that someone else is free if I am unfree, right? Because I am among the outvoted. That doesn't seem to give me a reason to accept the law as legitimate. Now, there's a second problem, which I will treat very briefly later on. So Kelsen's argument for the majority rule, as laid out so far, conflicts with his advocacy for formal constitutionalism. Sorry, there's something missing here. Enforced by constitutional review. So you're all aware that Kelsen was a fan of written constitutions, of constitutional restrictions on the powers of parliamentary majorities, and he advocated for the enforcement of such restrictions by constitutional courts. But of course, it might be argued, as has been pointed out many times before, that these institutions are counter-majoritarian. Okay, so if there is a constitutional court that can enforce some constitutional norm onto the democratic legislature, the democratic majority, you might arrive with an outcome that frustrates the desires of the majority, right? But that is precisely what democracy, or the majority rule, according to Kelsen's core argument, was supposed to prevent. So isn't there a glaring inconsistency between Kelsen's argument for the majority rule and his advocacy of constitutionalism? Good. So in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to say a few words about both of these objections. I'm going to try to outline, at least in a nutshell, how I think Kelsen tried to respond to these. So let's take the first objection first. How is it possible for the outvoted to identify with laws enacted by a majority? So Kelsen himself, in his writings on democracy, he puts great emphasis on the idea that if we want to understand the value of democracy, we must explicate the value of democracy by appeal to the ideal of freedom. And he often opposes the idea that democracy is to be explicated in terms of the value of equality. But I think that he did himself a disservice in this rhetoric, because in fact, his theory is committed to a certain conception of the equality of citizens. So I think, just as a historical aside, I guess he was emphasizing the idea of freedom against the idea of equality in trying to think about the value of democracy, because he was concerned to counter Marxist claims that liberal parliamentary democracy was a sham democracy if it didn't bring about material equality among citizens. Okay, and so Kelsen is concerned to reject that argument. But of course, you might think that there are other forms of equality other than substantive material equality that are important for the legitimacy of democracy. And I think if you read between the lines, indeed, you find some other forms of equality recognized in Kelsen's democratic writings. And so the first form of equality that Kelsen clearly recognizes is something like a fundamental equality of moral standing or political status of all citizens. So he clearly rejects the Aristotelian idea that there are some who are by nature called upon to rule over others because, I don't know, they have greater expertise or greater virtue. So a democracy is a system that takes collective decisions in a way, for Kelsen, that honors this fundamental equality in moral and political status. And of course, the way that a democracy does that is by according to all citizens equal and equally effective rights of political participation. And clearly Kelsen's political theory endorses such a call for equal and equally effective rights of political participation in a democracy. And that's the first dimension of equality that's recognized in Kelsen's argument. And so here again, think of yourself as a member of the outvoted. And the question is, what reasons might there be for you to identify with a law made by a majority, but one to which you don't belong because you voted for the other party, let's say. Well, one reason might be that, well, the decision to which you're now subject, of course, was taken as a result of a political process, a democratic process, a free and fair process that honors your fundamental political equality in affording you equal and equally effective rights of political participation. And of course, it's very much part of this picture that even after a decision has been taken, decisions remain revisable in the future. So elections are periodically repeated, and people who have been outvoted at a certain point in time have the chance to compete again under free and fair conditions in the future to win a majority and to make their view prevail. And I suppose the suggestion that Kelsen implies in his democratic writings is that if a system has this feature, it honors your equality and it's open to the future in such a way as to make you a potential member of a future majority, then that gives you a reason to accept a decision as legitimate, even if for now you're outvoted and you think substantively the decision is wrong-headed or to be rejected. Now there's a further background condition, you might say, of well-functioning democracy, or a background condition under which, as I said earlier, majority rule translates into authentic collective self-government that's recognized by Kelsen. Society is characterized ideally by a relative homogeneity that allows for political compromise and for the mutual recognition of the legitimacy of ongoing democratic political contestation. So I'm adopting this term relative homogeneity from Hermann Heller's Staatslehre. So Heller uses that term. Kelsen himself does not, but there are some passages in Kelsen's writings that express, I think, the same idea that Heller wants to refer to by speaking about relative homogeneity. So the idea is that if the differences of interest, conflicts of interest, perhaps ideological disputes are too deep or too conflicted, it may not be possible for a group of people to govern themselves collectively by use of the majority rule, because the minority would never find it acceptable to be subject to the decisions taken by the majority. So I suppose a certain degree of identification with the community, a certain degree of overlap of interests, of willingness to compromise and to recognize the other party as a legitimate political contestant is a sociological background condition for the majority rule to work. Okay, but I think the argument that Kelsen makes in his writings is that if these two conditions are fulfilled, so the political system treats all citizens as equal and gives them equally effective rights of participation, and if there is a relative homogeneity in the sense just explained, then the outvoted can be said to be included in a temporally extended legislative will or general will. Okay, so perhaps the will to which I'm subject now, because I'm now among the outvoted, is not general in the sense of including my interests, but really the will by which we are governed in a democracy is not just a will for now, it's a temporally extended will. So the people decides and redecides and elects and re-elects again and again indefinitely into the future. And if the background conditions that were laid out here are fulfilled, then it is reasonable for me to expect that at some point in the future, I will be a member of the majority and I will get to make laws, or I will see my own interests and preferences realized. And so in this sense, insofar as the will of the people is temporally extended, I am included in it. And it is this, I suppose, that allows me to identify with it, even in the situation where for now, my preferences have been thwarted. Now, this idea of relative homogeneity can be contrasted, just to go to another proposal, of course, that Kelsen argued against, with a demand for absolute homogeneity. So Kelsen's conception of democratic equality opposes such conception. So here I'm referring, unsurprisingly, to Carl Schmitt. And here on the slide, you see a quote drawn from Carl Schmitt's constitutional theory, the Verfassungslehre, where Schmitt talks about the idea of democratic equality. And so he says, the equality of all those who bear a human face, so that is apparently an implicit quotation from Fichte, is incapable to ground a state, a form of state, or a form of government. So it may be that in some sense, as human beings, we are all equal, but this is nothing to politics or to democracy. Democratic equality is a substantial equality of some type. It is because all citizens of the state participate in that substance. So I suppose they might all speak the same language. They might all be adherents of the same religion or supporters of the same ideology. It's because they participate in some such substance that they can be treated as equals. That is, that they have equal rights to participate in elections and to vote, etc. Okay, so the idea here is that, well, yes, democracy is majority rule in our understanding, but the majority rule, the application of it, would not be legitimate if it was just a means by which some majority oppresses despotically some minority. In order for that not to happen, for the majority rule to be legitimately applicable, people must already be equal prior to the application of democratic rules of collective decision-taking. So they must already share in some substantive similarity that, I suppose, engenders a sharing of interests and opinions, right? And it's when people share such a substantial identity, when they identify in political terms with some similarity, which they all already share as a group, that the majority rule will be legitimately applicable, because under those conditions, it will do no more than to express this pre-existing identity, right? But under conditions of deep social pluralism, the majority rule is illegitimate, right? It conceals the despotic rule of one faction over another. So the idea is that before the formal process of democratic decision-taking can get going, society must already have been homogenized for that process to be legitimate. That is Schmidt's view, which is, of course, rejected by Kelsen. So that is the conception of democratic equality he is set against. Now, looking at Kelsen's conceptions, I've tried to outline it in a nutshell. And looking at Schmidt's view, I think we can contrast two different paradigms of democracy. And this will take us back on the way towards the crisis of democracy and the evaluation of populism. So, as we've seen, everyone agrees that in a democracy, the people rule, and they do so by majority vote, right? But what does that mean? How are these phrases to be understood? And they are ambiguous, I think, because they can be interpreted in two different ways. And that leads us to these two different paradigms of democracy on the slide. So one of these I call the expressive paradigm. So this is the view, I guess, you can associate with Schmidt. So the people are united in advance of the application of democratic procedure by some substantive equality, and the results of the application of the majority rule merely express that underlying unity. And the formal apparatus of democracy is legitimate if and only if the underlying unity is already present. And this can be contrasted, with what I call a constructive paradigm, which unsurprisingly, of course, I associate with Kelsen. So Kelsen, of course, is someone who's very, very wary of the idea that there is a people or a will of the people apart from a legal or constitutional order, right? So he often describes theories that make that assumption as trading in an empty fiction. So for Kelsen, the people is, as for Kant, it's a legal idea, right? So the people comprises all those who are citizens, that is, who have rights of political participation, irrespective of whether they share in some substantive equality or not. And there is no will of the people for Kelsen that is antecedent to the results of collective decisions taken in a democratic procedure. So the will of the people is the product of the application of democratic rules of decision taking. So it's a revisable outcome, revisable indefinitely into the future in elections that are ever going to be repeated, a revisable outcome of the application of the majority rule. So here, of course, the idea is that there could be no such thing as a people or a will of the people before there is a democratic constitution. There are rules that determine how in a democratic constitution, collective decisions can be taken. So, I mean, Kelsen himself, I think, he contrasts these two conceptions or paradigms of democracy. But then he often says, well, which of these two to prefer to the other is not a scientific question. So it's a question that has to do with one's own value commitments, which are not scientifically justifiable. Okay, and so he sometimes concedes that, well, I mean, yes, you could be an expressivist, I suppose, and use the term democracy accordingly. But what he would be concerned to emphasize, I think, is that these two paradigms of democracy describe two very different political regimes. And what makes them different is that the values they serve are not the same. Okay, so the constructive form of democracy serves the value of freedom, individual freedom under law, right? The opportunity to see one's own aspirations and interests realized in the law. Whereas the constructive paradigm, I suppose, celebrates a sort of identification with the group, to which the individual is seen as subject. And really the attraction of it to people like Schmidt is that they think it will empower the community and to assert itself against its external enemies. And so when we use the term democracy, I mean, obviously we may have this or that preference, but it's important that we don't confuse these two political systems because they're altogether different, right? Good. Now, of course, Kelsen sympathized with, on the level of value judgment, with the constructive paradigm, and I take it so do many of us. Now, just a quick interlude before I come to my conclusion about this question of constitutionalism. So I said that it would appear there is some kind of conflict between Kelsen's general argument for the majority rule and his advocacy for constitutionalism. And so here's just to fill the picture in, here are Kelsen's ways to try to mitigate that apparent conflict. So the first point that he makes is one about constitutional complexity. So he says that it would be unwise to reject formal constitutionalism as undemocratic because it may be necessary to deal with constitutional complexity. And the key example of this, which of course is germane to both to the Austrian and the German context, is if you have a state that's a federal state, you need a constitution to delimit the competences of the federal government and the state governments. And perhaps you need constitutional adjudication to have an impartial control of whether these boundaries have been overstepped from either side. So that is one reason why formal constitutionalism might be needed. And unless you want to argue that a federal state cannot be democratic, this seems to suffice to show that there needn't be anything undemocratic necessarily about a system that's formally constitutional. So another argument that Kelsen makes is that there will be groups in some societies that are insular minorities, as American scholars call them. So groups perhaps that never really have a chance to be part of a governing coalition and that will be systematically cut out of the process of political representation. So if there are such groups, then for members of such groups, even a Kelsenian democracy would not give the promise to be a member of a majority at some point in the future. And it may be that at this point, minority rights are necessary to protect the interests of members of such groups. Just to give them leverage, that seems to be Kelsen's idea, in the political process, and to incentivize policies on the part of majorities that take proper account of the interests of insular minorities. And this again, of course, will serve the general interest or the general goal, namely to allow all citizens to identify, even if they are outvoted for now, with the outcomes of the democratic process. So the idea is that as a form of constitutionalism, perhaps a quite a thin and austere form of constitutionalism, as far as its content is concerned, that supports what I have called the temporal extension of the will of the people, okay? And so understood, constitutionalism is not undemocratic for Kelsen. Now, one final remark, of course, is that if you look back to the two paradigms, expressive and constructive, one key difference between signing on to one or the other is that if you're a constructivist, it is likely that you will have respect for the rules of the democratic game. So whether they are treated as mere conventions as in the UK, or whether they are laid down in a formal constitution. And perhaps you will think that it is appropriate for these rules of the game to be enforced by the courts, right? So a democratic system is essentially a legal phenomenon, according to the constructive view. But the expressive paradigm, on the other hand, of course, treats the law as something that comes second after political unity has already been secured. And of course, there's a tendency in the expressive paradigm to think that the law must take a backseat to politics if the two conflict. So the view clearly encourages the idea that the enforcement of a formal constitution is potentially an infringement of the will of the people, even if the constitution is quite austere and tries to protect the process of democracy and not to realize a substantive liberal ideology. Good. Now, last slide, conclusion. I think the building blocks are now in place to sort of come back to the problem of populism and to the question whether populism is inimical per se to democracy. And so let me just sort of try to lay out a line of reasoning towards that conclusion. So if you look at the rhetoric of populism, so this is something which is emphasized in the literature on populism. So for example, Jan Werner Müller's book on populism has lots of examples of this kind. The rhetoric is wedded, it seems, to the expressive paradigm of democracy. So there is this idea that there is a people, the true people, that's somehow already there. And the charismatic leader of a populist movement speaks for the true people. Okay. And well, if the outcomes of the democratic process don't align with what the leader claims is the will of the people, then, well, too bad for the democratic process. It must have been corrupted in some way by the elites. Okay. Now, populism, however, is also at the same time a response to the undeniable fact of pluralism in modern societies. So modern democratic societies, of course, they do not live up to the demand for absolute homogeneity that seems to be raised in Schmidt's version of the expressive paradigm. Okay, so you have a society that is internally divided. On the one hand, there are some people, perhaps the majority, who are members of the true people, defined politically, pre-legally, and then there are some other people who are, I don't know, not members of the people, internal enemies perhaps, or evil elites, or whatever you want to call them, right? But they may be quite a sizable group, perhaps not much smaller than the majority that's claimed by the populist movement. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you have a democratic process, you take votes, you have elections, and so on and so forth. Okay, but you also assume that the outcomes of the elections are only legitimate if the right people win, right? If the wrong people win, then the process must have been corrupted. So this is the essence, I suppose, of the Trumpian challenge to the legitimacy of the election of Biden, if you want an example. Now, what the populist rhetoric does, to put it differently, is to identify one of the political groups or one of the political factions in a condition of pluralism with the people as a whole. And populism, since it is committed, as I said, to the expressive paradigm, it implies that the political adversary, so the other side, that contest the claims of the populist movement, that they don't belong to the people and thus need not be given a fair opportunity to contest for power. So this is why, suppose, a populist movement or a populist leader might go about, once they have won a majority or once they have come into power, to rearrange the political process in such a way as to disadvantage the opposition, right? So this is seen to be legitimate because, well, the opposition aren't people who are among the people, the true people. So why would you have to give them a fair chance to win an election in the future, right? So what you ought to do in order to make the true will of the people prevail is to skew the playing field so that the oppressed, the anti-elite, supposedly represented by the charismatic leader, will win out. And so this is very much the process that you see in many of the countries that political scientists say are regressing from democracy towards a soft form of authoritarianism. So now here's the conclusion. So populism will tend to destroy not merely liberal freedom. So the danger is not merely that a majority will make laws that violate a liberal right that we think individuals ought to enjoy as good liberals. So it will also destroy the integrity of the political process, or what I have called the temporal extension of the will of the people, which the constructive paradigm aims to protect. And in doing that, of course, it will make it impossible for people who are not members of the, or supporters of the governing group, to identify with the decisions taken by the current majority. And as a result, of course, the constructive dimension of democracy, or the future-oriented dimension of democracy, will be undercut and destroyed. And you're really left in the position of either having to switch your political allegiance, I suppose, or accept that you are an enemy of the people, that it is right that your interests are being trampled upon. So now, of course, I take it that if you are attracted to the constructive paradigm of democracy, then you will see populism as undemocratic. And just perhaps a final word on this. So it seems to me that one thing that makes this Kelsenian constructive paradigm attractive is that it's not just a rehash of something like a Dworkinian understanding of democracy as essentially liberal, okay? So really what we have here is not a conflict between liberal democracy and electoral democracy. What we have is a conflict between the constructive and the expressive paradigm. But that's a conflict within the house of electoral democracy itself, right? So if we agree that the integrity of electoral democracy is crucial, then populism is anti-democratic per se. I mean, quite apart from whether populist leaders have other goals, substantive goals that we think are illiberal, such as to oppress homosexuals. Good. So that's the contribution, I think, that Kelsen can make to the debate about the contemporary crisis of democracy. I think he provides us with the building blocks for an argument that shows that there really is a crisis of democracy. It's not just a crisis of liberal democracy, but of democracy. And well, perhaps he's even had some interesting observations about how to respond to the crisis. And so my conclusion then would be that Kelsen ought to be recognized more by political theorists, by theorists of democracy than he currently is. Okay, so thank you very much. And I look forward to your question.
We thank you very much, Professor Lars. And we open our block of questions and comments. We have 22 minutes. If you want to break the ice, I'm open to it. Cristiano Oita, do you want to speak?
Oh, okay. So very briefly, well, congratulations on the presentation, Professor Vinx. Well, could you comment on the role played by the judicial review in Kelsen in terms you've mentioned en passant in your presentation about it? So how could you draw a relation between the judicial review in Kelsenian terms and the strengthening of constructive democracy, as you mentioned in your presentation? Is there a possible relation or how judicial review could play a role in fighting populism? So could you comment a little bit on that?
Yes, so I think it seems to me Kelsen or Kelsenian should not deny that, first of all, that there could be a democracy that works perfectly well as a democracy, but that does not have a written constitution, that does not practice constitutional review. So the UK would be the obvious example. And I think Kelsenian should also admit that it is perfectly possible that constitutionalism and constitutional review may be employed in ways that are anti-democratic. So of course, it can't be denied that you may have a scenario where say, a written constitution is made by a group that currently has the power to make a constitution, but that fears to be a minority in the future, and that's just going to write its own political preferences into the constitution so as to preserve them against being overturned by a later democratic majority. And if constitutional review and constitutionalism are used for this purpose, then I think a Kelsenian should admit that they are in conflict with democracy. So But I take it that there's a position in between these two, which is to say that constitutional review and formal constitutionalism might be helpful or conducive to the running of a constructive democracy, on the condition, first of all, that the Constitution itself, in terms of its content, is limited to protecting the rights that are necessary for the democratic process to be free and fair and to be truly representative. And if, of course, the judges on a constitutional court are willing to accept that their doctrine should be austere and that they should do no more than to enforce the integrity of the democratic process. And it seems to me that if these two conditions are fulfilled, then a system of formal constitutionalism could be supportive of what I have called the constructive paradigm of democracy. And so in particular, I think perhaps such a system could have a kind of signaling function. So if you look at the processes of retrogression that we observe at the moment, then of course one striking feature of what's happening in Hungary and Poland and Turkey is that the first thing that the would-be a charismatic populist leader tries to do is to undermine the independence of the judiciary. Okay, and perhaps they do this not so much because they think that the judiciary will stop them from implementing certain policies that they might be interested in implementing, but because they want the judiciary out of the way in the second step of their project, which is to change the rules of the political game in such a way as to entrench themselves in power. And it seems to me that if you had a formal constitution committed to the protection of democracy, at least it would make it clear once this process gets underway that a problem is brewing, and it would force, ideally, I guess, it would force the populists into having to explain why they want to destroy constructive democracy and expose them to a higher justificatory burden they might otherwise face.
Guy Morgan, oh, sorry. Guy Morgan, do you have a question? Do you want to talk or do you want to speak, or may I speak in your name?
Trying to unmute. I was just wondering, listening, how the with the worry that the constitutional review can also thwart the democratic will or of a constitution that was made by a faction that's now become a minority, how the processes for constitutional amendment, do they deal with that worry, or they just, how do they fit in with that worry? That's what I was wondering about as the democratic will evolves, because I think most constitutions have some sort of process for amendment.
Yes, so I think that you would have to look at individual cases, and of course it's a crucial question here, how easy or how difficult it might be to amend the Constitution. And so I guess it might be fairly straightforward, as it was, I guess, in the Weimar Republic, for instance, where really a parliamentary supermajority can bring about a constitutional amendment, right? And which happened quite often, I suppose, in Germany in the interwar period. But you could imagine a constitution that makes it much more difficult, or perhaps even impossible to amend the Constitution. So you might have a constitutional eternity clause that says that, well, short of a complete abolition of the constitutional system as a whole, a certain norm can't be changed. And
well, that would be probably reflective of an expressive constitutional paradigm,
yes.
rather than
so I think Kelsen,
I'm thinking in a constructive paradigm, yeah.
Right. So I think Kelsen would be hostile, or should be hostile, probably, to such a very, very strong rule of amendment, or perhaps an eternity clause, because so what the constitutional protection is supposed to do is to give the minority some political leverage, or to incentivize compromise on the part of the majority. And in order to reach this goal, I suppose, a supermajoritarian rule would be sufficient. But an eternity clause would make it altogether impossible for the people to change their mind about something and perhaps to rearrange affairs in this or that way. So I think he would have to say that this conflicts with this idea of the open-endedness of the democratic will. And
wouldn't you have to say that a constructive constitution would have to be amendable, though?
Yes, it should. Yes, I think so, yes. And interestingly,
then how do you keep it from being too amendable?
Well, I guess it really, it would depend on the circumstances, I suppose, of the particular case. And I think that perhaps we should also be modest and admit that constitutional design cannot rule out the possibility that democracy will fail, or that the democratic process that's supposed to be implemented by this constructive paradigm will just be discontinued. And so Kelsen himself was aware of that, and he had some of his writings in the early 1930s make the point that well, it may be that for sociological reasons, economic reasons, political, cultural reasons, it just becomes impossible to for democracy to survive. And what you should do as a Democrat at that point is not to try to push back with violent measures or measures of militant democracy, but to preserve the purity of the democratic ideal by making it clear that the system is transitioning into something that is no longer democratic. And so there is no absolute assurance through constitutional design against failure, I think, for Kelsen.
Yes, I got a smoke alarm going off, so I have to go see if I'm going to burn the house down.
Okay.
Ian and Stuart, do you want to intervene? Ian? Ian say, not another question, but an observation. Thomas Olechevsky's biography of Kelsen has a detailed account of how the Constitutional Court that Kelsen designed and served on was subverted when the democratic majority in the Austrian parliament changed from left to right.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, so perhaps that is one example of the process that I tried to talk about, is democratic regression, that Kelsen himself observed and theorized. And it may be that his theory is applicable to contemporary circumstances precisely because he witnessed very similar processes going on in Austria and Germany in the 1920s, 1930s.
Professor Ian Smith, you want to reply?
No, thank you.
Okay. Jorge, it's your turn.
Thank you, Lars. I have many questions, and I've already read, your draft. So very quickly, it's a guilty pleasure to ask you this question face to face. How effective can democratic processes be in light of populism? And by the way, I'm not against populism. I get your point. But I see from your presentation clearly, and we talked about that yesterday, and later with Zaleska, we'll talk about fictions. I can see the valid side, the logical side, the Kelsenian side. But then I have to go to the effective side, yes. And I'm thinking metaphorically or historically cases like Socrates or cases like Jesus, in which populism had, we had the perfect democracy, and then we had Socrates, and then we have, Jesus, again, metaphorical or historically, just to put examples. And then I'm going to come to Latin America simply, not to hurt people, because I am from Latin America. And we've seen, from, again, I'm not against or in favor, it's just putting examples from military governments or coups supported by people, even in this country, in the UK, Margaret Thatcher, and we had to create the Falkland War because it was a popularity contest between the military government in Argentina. And I write about this, and the UK here, they were both going to lose power, so they needed, that war. And many others. So my question to you, Lars Vinx, and if you want to answer, ask Kelsen, it would be a pleasure as well. Yeah. How effective? Again, I'm not interested in the validity, side of it. I'm interested in the effective side. Is there such a way? Because Guy, and I'm hoping Guy, I pronounce right your name, put it right, what about if we are amending constantly the Constitution? And we've seen that in Latin America, you know, with or without following the procedure, with a legal revolution or with a legal evolution in Kelsenian vocabulary, but we've seen that times and times again. So again, I'm showing examples, you know, simply to put, you know, metaphoric examples and real case scenarios that are happening right now. Again, your paper, I think it's the right time for your paper right now, globally. Thank you very much.
Well, I suppose in part the question is empirical. I take it, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm competent to answer it, as I'm not a political scientist, I suppose. But I mean, part of the context in which Kelsen develops his argument is, I guess, a debate among socialists or social democrats about political strategy. And I suppose that there's a camp in the social democratic movement that thinks that social democratic goals, economic goals, social goals can be realized through the democratic process by winning a legislative majority in a constitutional democracy and then making laws with a content that's adapted to social democratic or socialist goals. And then there's another camp, I suppose, which is represented by Max Adler in the controversy that Kelsen had with Adler, where the view is that, well, a liberal democracy is not a true democracy. It prevents the full liberation of the working class, and we shouldn't wait to win a majority. We should walk a revolutionary and dictatorial path to create a truly just socialist society. And so this is the argument that Kelsen is opposing, in a sense. And what he's trying to show is that it's better to embrace the peaceful reformist path as opposed to the violent dictatorial one. And well, that project has failed, at least in Austria and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. And so perhaps part of the reason why it has failed is that it wasn't successful enough in winning legislative majorities and then creating policies that took care of the social problems that gave rise to the socialist movement. And so perhaps a part of the answer is that the effectiveness of a constructive democracy will depend on how good it is at policy making, whether it manages to satisfy the interests of a large enough range of voters or not. And I suppose that's a precondition for it to continue to exist in the long run. But what Kelsen is concerned with, of course, is that if it is replaced due to a lack of success by a more authoritarian system, then we are going to lose something besides, I suppose, sound policies, namely our political freedom. And he is hoping to be able to avoid that. And perhaps we face a similar crisis today. So it may be that, although I guess people disagree about that, that the current crisis of democracy has something to do with the destruction of the welfare state that was put in place after the Second World War in most Western countries, and the rise of economic inequality.
Are there more questions or comments, or may I intervene? May I? I have only one small question about the consistency of Kelsenian theory. I mean, the problem is if the justification of the majority rule by Kelsen make the pure theory of law impure.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
If the defense of the majority rule by Kelsen make the pure theory of law impure.
Well, I guess I should say on Kelsen's behalf that it doesn't. I mean, that's the answer that Kelsen would give, I'm sure. And of course, what he would say, I think, is that there's a difference between different intellectual projects that he's engaged in. So I guess he has a jurisprudential or legal philosophical project. That's the pure theory of law, which is pure in being value-free, of course. But that you are committed as a legal theorist to the demand for purity, of course, does not entail that you have to be committed to purity if you wear a different hat and write a book as a political theorist or perhaps as a political sociologist. So if you write as a political theorist, perhaps it is legitimate to bring value analysis into the picture. And perhaps if you're a political sociologist, it is legitimate to violate the second condition of purity and to make reference to empirical facts. And so I think Kelsen would say that, of course, the pure theory as a legal theory doesn't tell us that we ought to prefer democracy to any other constitutional framework. It doesn't say that in order to be a legal system, a political or legal system has to be organized in a particular way and with respect to how legislative decisions are taken, right? It's just a different intellectual field that we are moving in. And I think Kelsen, what makes Kelsen interesting, or more interesting in my view than someone like H.L.A. Hart, is that he wore all these different hats and that he wasn't just a legal theorist, but he was a political theorist, he was a legal historian, he was a sociologist, an anthropologist. And I find that well, whatever he did was always invariably interesting and insightful. And so in part, perhaps, what I'm trying to do is just to add a bit of flavor to the conference by saying that, well, look at the non-jurisprudential works as well, and you will find interesting things.
Thank you very much. We have only 3 minutes. If Professor Ian Stewart, oh, we have 2 questions. The first one is from Professor Ian Stewart. He says that Kelsen's political thinking is not part of the reine theory.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this. And
it's very simple. The answer to your question, therefore, is no.
Yes, I could have said no. That's true. Yes.
Thank you. Professor Jürgen Bosch, do you want to intervene?
It's just an observation that the statement of Kelsen that what makes him looking for a common basis of a highly pluralistic society, as he was confronted with the Habsburg monarchy, where during the First World War he was barred as being the advisor to the Minister of Defense or Minister of War, it was called by that time, and was entrusted with the task to try to reconcile different constitutional interests between the Hungarian and the Austrian part of the state, of the Habsburgian state. And out of this political task, he was entrusted with could only find one answer for him, that it's only the legal system, the state constructed by the legal system and defined by the legal system, forms this kind of common ground for a highly pluralistic society. And interestingly enough, when he was then entrusted with another political task, being part of drafting the Austrian Republic constitution, he was quite in favor of accession of the new Austrian Republic to Germany because of more common grounds of national homogeneity. So this is interesting, and this for me a kind of good statement by Kelsen how his political and legal theory has to be read together. Yeah.
Yes, that's right, I think, but perhaps it could be added that, of course, even though Kelsen's theorizing was animated by this historical context that you described, of course, that context is very typical. In the sense that very, very few modern societies are not in some way deeply pluralistic. And so it seems to me that his approach to thinking about constitutional matters is more productive than one that starts out from the fiction that there is a united will of the people.
Professor Stewart?
I think Olszewski's biography shows that Kelsen was in favor of Anschluss, as they still called it, or called it already, along with many others, because Germany was democratic. And the union with democratic Germany would enhance democracy in Austria-Hungary, and that would be a left-wing move for Austria-Hungary against the Catholic right, which eventually prevailed over him in the Constitutional Court. That was, I think, his reason for wanting union with Germany, not a general cultural reason.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question of hypothetical history, how things might have worked out constitutionally if that accession had taken place. But of course,
it's a nice literature on counter history.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but I think it's a combination of both. He shared this German nationalism with many social democratic politicians, Austrian politicians as well at that time.
Mm. But of course, if Austria had acceded to the Weimar Republic, then it would presumably have strengthened a constitutional vision for Weimar Germany, which would have been closer to Kelsen's own template, right? It would have made the system even more openly federal. It would have provided some counterweight, I guess, to this Prussia problem, and might have made it easier to run the constitution as a federal constitution, and then to bring in stronger measures of constitutional control to enforce a federal constitution, which of course was the trend that was then interrupted in 1933. So, yeah, who knows?
We thank you very much, Professor Lars Vinx. It was very, very, very interesting. And we have two papers more. We have Professor Jingshu Wang from the University of Political Science and Law from China. After 30 minutes of presentations, we have Professor Phil Edwards from Manchester University. And after these 30 minutes of presentation, we have 30 minutes for question for both papers. So Professor Jingshu Wang.
Yeah, actually, I'm not a professor, thanks. I'm now a doctoral student in the China University of Political Science and Law. And I have a slide. I tried to share it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, okay. Okay. So the topic today I'd like to report is resolve non-complex and uphold international law. The report will be 4 parts. Firstly, I would like to give a background of the topic, and then the general theory of norms and norms conflict. The third part would be to extend talking about the basic norm and the monism of legal system, use the Kelsen's theory. And the fourth part is norm-complex in international law. And finally, I will give 2 examples of international law cases to describe how these theories and techniques used in tribunals' decisions. So first, the background of the topic. I started to thinking about this topic about 5 years ago. So it's it started from the conflict of norms between environmental protection and transnational nature resources exploitation. It appears that the WTO laws and other branches of international law always have the conflict on certain topics. And facing global crisis in recent years, a harmonized international legal system and a better interaction between the international law and domestic legal orders can be helpful in many meanings. And the new posture of international courts and tribunals is the spirit of systematic harmonization. However, to achieve several aims at once, such as health, dignity, and economic growth, actions of states are regulated by their domestic laws and foreign legal orders, as well as international law. Not all these interests, however, are always in harmony with each other, which lead to increasing number of disputes and higher risks. For example, the epidemics caused many conflicts between domestic laws and WHO law and other branches of international law, like international environmental law. So I intend to elaborate the conflict situations and review the understanding of conflict of legal norms in international law theory. Some recent research believe that parts of norm conflicts in international law are irresolvable and constitute a legal dilemma, and the possible resolutions are regional interaction and politicization. While the political cooperation of the sovereign actor surely a welcomed and effective way of solving conflicts, however, a resolution from an internal perspective of legal system still exists. Kelsen's concept of basic norm builds the vital link between international law and domestic laws, since the validity of different norms, which are respectively picked from international and domestic laws, can trace back to the same basic norm. Then these norms belong to a same legal system. There is no difference in nature between international and domestic legal norms in Kelsen's monism legal system. On this base, other legal theory not specifically created for international law can be applied to solve the problems of conflict of norms in international law cases. At the meantime, this general legal theory, by applying in international law background, receive more explanatory power. The theory of norms of Kelsen and Dworkin and Alexey can be applied to establish a refinement understanding and legal resolution of norm conflicts. I will review the discussion in legal theory and international law researches on conflict of norms, then international law cases will be discussed. The first part, the second part, the second part will be analysis of the general theory of norm conflicts and so Kelsen makes a clear distinction between contradictions between statements and conflicts between norms. I quote, two contradictory statements exist side by side, but only one of them can be true. And when one of them is true, the other must be false. And he also says the conflict of norms obtains when one norm decrees a certain behavior to be obligatory and the other decrees the omission of this behavior to be obligatory. The situation created by a conflict of norms is one in which observing one of the conflicting norms implies violating the other, and not a situation in which only one of them can be valid. The meaning of distinguishing contradiction of statements and conflict of norms is that they need different solutions. Kelsen explains in the pure theory of law that a logical contradiction cannot be solved by interpretation, and the conflict of norms can and must be solved by interpretation. So we need to we need to point it out that the conflict of norms we find in most cases can be solved by interpretation, but most of the times they are not irresolvable. Yeah. So, however, Kelsen didn't distinguish between legal rules and the principles. However, when discussing the interpretation of international law, the International Law Commission clarifies the two types of norm, and it cited working on the logical differences of rule and the principles, and take the distinction into account. We can start to discuss the conflict of norms in international law. So trace back to Kelsen's theory of norm conflicts. He discussed two situations of norm conflicts. One is conflict between norms of same level, and the other situation is between norms of different levels. So the first one, the conflict between norms of same level have clear resolutions, just like lex posterior or lex specialis. And Kelsen points out that no conflict is possible between a higher norm and a lower norm, as a legal norm which might be said to be in conflict with the norm that determines its creation could not be regarded as a valid legal norm. So his higher norm and the lower norm are have a specific meaning, that the higher one gives the validity to the lower one. So he thinks under this definition, they cannot be conflict with each other. So when we want to apply the above general discussion about norm conflicts in international law context, a presumption needs to be clarified. That is, the norms that are said to be conflict with each other are norms in one legal system. When norms picked from domestic law of one sovereign state are apparently in one legal order, it's not so easy to say the same when to say the same when norms are picked from different branches of international law or from domestic law and international law. So I trace back to the concept of basic norm and the reason of validity of a legal system. So this is the third part of the report, by saying, so since the, I quote, since the basic norm is the reason for the validity of all norms belonging to the same legal order, the basic norm constitutes the unity of the multiplicity of these norms. Use the basic norm in our topics of conflict of norms. We point out that when we talking about solving the conflict of norms, we need to clarify that they are norms in one legal system, and in order to have this presumption, we can use the monism of legal system theory of Kelsen. So in his problem of sovereignty and the theory of international law and the principles of international law, Kelsen criticized the dualism of state law and the international law. The traditional view separates international law and state law into two completely distinct systems of norms. But Kelsen points out that the construction is logically untenable. So he gives two critiques of this dualism. The first one is a critique of the duality of sources, and the second is the duality of regulatory objects. I would like to explain here the first critique a bit more. Dualism argues that domestic law and international law have different sources. One is legislation and the other one are international treaties and customary law. Therefore, the validity reasons of domestic law and international law are different. Kelsen points out that the procedure of a norm being created is not the real validity reason, but the norm's higher level norm. And finally, the basic norm are the reason of validity. So this is the critique of the duality of sources. As for the second critique, it's almost obvious today that domestic and international law overlaps with each other on the content they regulate. So that's not a good reason to say that international and domestic law are completely separate legal system. So by criticize the dualism theory and build his monism of legal system, Kelsen believes that he argues that the domestic law and international law are in one same legal system. They did not naturally different from each other. So the fourth part, I'm going into non-conflicts in international law. Recent research called irresolvable non-conflicts in international law create a new concept that is legal dilemma. He says a legal dilemma exists when a sovereign state faces two norms of international law that are irreducible and concretized so that they each contain an unequivocal obligation, permission or prohibition of a certain conduct. So the reasons of such dilemmas can be imperfect drafting, the non-hierarchical nature of international law and international laws, fragmentation, etc. However, the International Law Commission have pointed out the situation of international laws fragmentation about 20 years ago. I think it's not an excuse to say that the conflict of norms in international law practices are a legal dilemma and cannot be solved by some techniques inside legal system, legal practice, but can only solved by a political practice. So, so to solve the non-conflicts this part, I will continue to share you with the non-complex situations in international law. So there are two kinds of categories. The first is by the sphere of validity. So it can it has several situations of conflicts, like different branches of international law or norms from different sources of international law, like the treaties have conflicts with customary international law or jus cogens, and international laws conflict with domestic laws. This is by the sphere of validity, and by the function of norms. There are three kinds of functions of norms, like setting obligations, setting prohibitions, and authorized permissions. All these different function of norms can conflict with each other. Now I will give two example cases to elaborate how the conflict of norms shows in international law cases. The first one is Southern Bluefin tuna case. In this case, Japan argues that according to lex specialis and lex posterior, the Convention on the Conservation of the Southern Bluefin tuna should be applied in the case and exclude the application of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, because the Convention on the Southern Bluefin tuna is created later and have some more specific regulations on this specific action. However, the tribunal points out that in the practice of international law, it's common that several treaties regulate a specific dispute. In current practice, a later and supplementary treaty do not necessarily lead to the obligation under a framework convention become invalid to the parties of the supplementary treaty. The decision of Southern Bluefin tuna case shows the resolution of conflict between different branches of international law. It can be understood more clearly by using Kelsen's view that the different branches of international law, they have common validity reason from the basic norm of the international law. So these norms so whether we can apply these different norms from different branches of the international law can be considered together, and also the principle behind the rules, the specific rules, like the environmental protection and the other principles like the economic use of the creation of the sea can be both considered in this case, and discussed whether discuss which one is more important and should be protected. Yeah. Let's see the another case. It's a famous case in environmental protection. It's Gabčíkovo-Nagimalo's project case in 1997. It's about whether Hungary should continue to conduct the project under the 1977 bilateral treaty on Gabčíkovo-Nagimalo's project. The treaty, the two parties of the treaty is Hungary and Slovakia Republic. And as the development, there is a customary international law from environmental protection branches requires states to obey the prudence principle to prevent cause environmental damage to other states' land. So Hungary cite the prudence principle in international environmental law, and the principle of sustainable development. Hungary argues that the sustainable development principle has already become customary international law. So Hungary wants to stop conduct this project, and Slovakia Republic cite the Pacta sunt servanda, so the treaty should be continued and the project should be continued. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in its decision said although the Pacta sunt servanda is an important principle, is also a customary international law, and so in this case there are two customary international law conflict with each other, and the court decision finally asked Hungary and Slovakia Republic to adapt their bilateral treaty and make it more suitable and to apply the principle of sustainable development. So in this case, we can see that a bilateral treaty may conflict with customary international law. That's a conflict between different sources of international law, and also two principles, two customary international law can conflict with each other also. So the resolution of this case gives an example of how to understand this conflict and how to resolve it by a legal way. Yeah, that's the two cases. So I'll give a short conclusion. So the main point I want to use Kelsen's theory into into resolution of international conflict, international norms conflict, is that traditionally we didn't use the principle of the theory of principles and general theory of law in international cases, and Kelsen's monism, and he's argued that the domestic law and international law are in one legal system based on they both have their validity reason are both the same basic norm, give us a direction that we can use this general legal theory in international law cases to solve the conflict of norms. So that's my report. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jingshu. Professor Edwards?
Okay, I'll just get my presentation up. Right. Okay, can everyone see that? Right. Okay, so I'm looking at the question of international law and Kelsenian monism. The problem I'm looking at is how international law can be considered as a system in the Kelsenian sense. Kelsen quite explicitly doesn't contrast the idea of an international legal system to contemporary reality. You know, in other words, he's not setting out the way that international law would look if it was fully developed, if there was a world state and so on. He presents international law as a system in the Kelsenian sense, hierarchically organized, ultimately grounded in a basic norm. But he presents that as a description of contemporary reality. And he's very vague about the past of international law as well. So by implication, international law is, and more or less has always been, a system in the Kelsenian sense. And this is, you know, quite a lot to swallow, really. It seems much more intuitive to look at the long and conflictual and frankly bloody history of international law, you know, going back to the first time one nation first encountered another, and see it as pure politics, as a very conflictual and very diverse and various history, rather than as any kind of system existing over time. And if you do take the leap with Kelsen of considering actually existing international law as a system, well, what on earth could its good norm, what on earth could its basic norm be? Kelsen has various runs at it, you know, at the idea of a customary norm which countenances custom as a law-creating fact. And his most articulate suggestion is this line from General Theory of Law and State: the states ought to behave as they have customarily behaved. The trouble with that, if you put it in any kind of historical perspective, is that, you know, the customary behavior of states towards other states includes, you know, everything from Kant to Schmidt, you know, everything from Bartolomé de las Casas to Governor Eyre, who put down the Morant Bay Rebellion. You know, whatever you're doing, carry on doing it. It doesn't really bite, even to the sort of minimal sense that a basic norm needs to bite, I think. Kelsen's answer to, you know, what is it about international law that makes it possible to consider it as a system when it is so different from a domestic legal system? Kelsen's answer centres on this notion of the primitive. And advance to the next slide. I will advance to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes is firstly looking at the reason why we might want to call international law a system rather than just delegate it to politics. Secondly, the idea of a primitive legal system, what the various things that might mean. Thirdly, most importantly, and the body of the talk will be looking at what Kelsen meant by primitive, and this I'll be drawing on his neglected and in many ways rightly neglected text, Society and Nature, from various dates in the 1940s. I'll come on to that. And in Society and Nature, he set out a model of the primitive, as he understood it, and of primitive retributivism. And this, I think, makes it possible to understand international law as a primitive system in much more depth. The trouble with the idea of the primitive, and this is the final section of this paper, is that it's a very corrosive critical tool, and I think probably more corrosive than Kelsen entirely realised when he first developed it. And as I'll point out in the last section, you know, once international law has been described as primitive, it becomes possible to describe many more things as primitive as well, including arguably the pure theory itself. So, Kelsen may have set a bomb under his own system by developing this argument. So why would we want to have a monistic model in the first place? It originates with Kelsen's argument that law should be considered as a whole without any internal contradictions. This in turn derives in Kelsen's argument from his neo-Kantian argument, his idea that law should be apprehended through a process of legal cognition. And because it's apprehended through legal cognition, it is understood as a logical object in itself, and as such it cannot be contradictory, which is a very shaky argument in my view, and one that Kelsen would have been better off not pursuing, but there we are. I think the principle of non-contradiction is still sort of valid and useful, however, cut free of its Kantian foundations. I think the principle that we know that law is the kind of thing that's there to guide people's behaviour, therefore in any given situation it must be possible to ask and answer the question, what's the law here? Therefore any contradiction is a problem. It's not to say that no laws can contradict, just that contradiction is identifiable as a thing and as a problem, as something to be resolved within the law. I think that the more sort of constructivist principle of non-contradiction, it remains valid and would have served Kelsen well. But in any case, if we proceed from a principle of non-contradiction, we arrive quite rapidly at the idea of continuity between all positive law and the idea of a universal legal system. I think Jorge was commenting on this yesterday. A universal legal system comprising the national domestic legal systems and international. And Kelsen argues, particularly in the second edition of the Pure Theory, that whether one starts from international law or from domestic law, whether one takes international law or domestic law as one's starting point, either way, international law is logically prior to each domestic system. There's quite a long demonstration of that in the second edition of the Pure Theory, which I won't go into now, but it's dense, but it's quite convincing. If we take it that, as I think we should, that international law is logically prior to domestic legal systems, this has certain implications. International law can be seen as international law in its vast diversity in space and time, can be seen as situating nation states. And if we remember that for Kelsen there really is no such thing as a state, the state is the legal system. The state isn't subject to the legal system, the state is the legal system. We can see how international law is actually delimiting national legal systems. International law delimits their going hence and their coming hither. It says when they start and end, how far they go, how far they extend. This, and there's been a lot of confusion about this and a lot of essentially straw man arguments. I'm looking at you, Hart, and about what Kelsen was or wasn't saying. He wasn't saying that international law came first, particularly not in any developed form. He wasn't saying that the logical unity of all valid law implied any kind of procedural or operational unity. Joseph Raz, unpacks what he takes to be Kelsen's argument at some length and shows that it's incoherent, but really, talks past Kelsen on this one. It also doesn't imply, circling back to my starting point, it doesn't imply that international law is at all highly developed. That said, a very undeveloped international legal realm does seem problematic. You know, if you're going to say that international law is a system that's more or less anarchic, doesn't seem to work. And this is where the idea of a primitive legal system comes in. And Kelsen is very clear that he views international law as a primitive rather than a developed legal system. Primitive can mean a number of things. Primitive can simply be a synonym for decentralized. And in general theory, Kelsen likens international law to the law of pre-state societies, pre-colonial societies, and so on. There's no central authority, there's no central legislature, there's custom instead. Enforcement is by self-help, blood feud, vendetta, and so on. And there is still a legal system. It's just that legal system, just as in a developed system, the legal system is identified with the state. In the pre-state world, the legal system is identical with the community. The community is its own legal system. And this can also be applied to the international law. The word primitive can also mean, and again, this is a meaning Kelsen was quite quick to adopt, the idea of law that's evolving towards greater sophistication. And this idea wasn't original to Kelsen by any means. Pollock and in the 19th century, Brierley in the 20th century had used very similar terms. The third meaning, which I'm going to dwell on, is the more developed meaning of the word primitive, ironically, developed in this text, Society and Nature, which is an English version of a German text originally published in 1941, a very eccentric work, very largely composed of Kelsen's readings of ethnographic texts, in which he tries to, well, arguably successfully, he traces the contemporary notion of causality back to its roots in what he considers to be primitive retributivism. The ethnography, which is the great body of the book, is very eccentrically handled. He Talcott Parsons' review, it famously said that if this was submitted to him as a doctoral thesis, he would fail it. Kelsen, ranges enormously widely over space and time, cherry picks his evidence, and brings everything back to a notion of the primitive mind, the primitive worldview, which is now rightly seen as very, very problematic. He essentially sees the pre-colonial society as composed of idiots, really, people with no rationality, no ego, no sense of where their agency ends and natural causality begins. So it was seen as very bad ethnography, or very bad use of ethnography at the time, and certainly hasn't dated very well since. So with all of those caveats, I'm going to plough on and look at Kelsen's concept of the primitive, because seen as a sort of free-floating concept rather than as something that describes anyone who's ever lived, it is interesting. So, and I think useful in the concept, in the very different context of international law. So the primitive for Kelsen involves a lack of ego consciousness, no sense of I, no sense of actions deriving from an inner subjective agency. So it's a very collective mindset. It's also not concerned with inner thought processes. A kind of animistic relationship to the natural world, but not egoistic. He says not an ego relationship, but a two relationship. In other words, seeing the natural world as another person almost. A strong sense, this is important, a tendency to substantialize, to see anything good or bad that happens as sort of loading you down with a substance, a bad substance that has to be reciprocated in an attack on the person or the thing that's given you the bad thing, a good substance as a debt that's, you know, that will ultimately need to be repaid. And this leads to a tendency to respond to any kind of misfortune with retaliation, to respond to any kind of good fortune with some kind of reciprocation. And it's pages and pages of, you know, in such and such a place, if they have a good hunt, they go out and sacrifice some of what they've killed, and this is, you know, paying back for their good fortune. In such and such a place, if a tree falls down in a storm, they, you know, go and curse the wind or something, and this is retaliation. Pages and pages of this stuff, you know, handled, as I say, very selectively. So this is, you know, the mentality he's describing. Good and evil, misfortune and good fortune seen as substances which, you know, vengeance must follow wrong, some kind of reward or rectification must follow good fortune. Events aren't caused logically by you know, by causal sequences. Events are caused by somebody's responsibility. Somebody did this. Some force did this. If something, you know, entirely natural happens, then somebody must have been cursed. You know, it must be somebody's fault. No ego consciousness means no individual liability. It also means no mens rea. You know, means absolute liability. But you know, Kelsen stresses this sort of very primitive, very basic version of retributivism is underlies more developed concepts of justice. Where does this leave with international law? So we, you know, first of all, I've already said that if we see the legal system as identical with the, you know, in a sense identical with the state that instantiates it, or with the community that instantiates it, in the sense of pre-state communities, that model can also be applied to international law. Even though there is no world state, there is a community under international law in some sense. And I think it's arguable that you know, international law is a primitive legal system in this more developed sense, characterized by no adjudication between individuals. You know, it's not the individual who does things; it's the nation state. No centralized authority, clearly, and by a rule of, you know, retaliation and reciprocation. And if we proceed from that and think about what the basic norm of international law might be, I think we get something like this. You know, let there be collective identities, because, you know, if you don't think collectively, you can't get anywhere. Let there be repayment, let there be retribution, let there be reciprocation. And I think, you know, rather than, you know, I think Kelsen went slightly wrong when he said that the basic norm of international law would be something like, let states behave as they customarily behave, because, you know, it's pretty fundamental to Kelsen's system that laws bind on individuals. The state, you know, laws binding on states are only partial laws. I think that for the basic norm of international law, you need to go right back to the start and say there's some undertaking like this. Whatever is done to any of us by one of them, let us collectively ensure that its consequences are borne by them. And I thought there was an interesting parallel here. He quotes the ethnologist Radcliffe Brown in General Theory, saying that in tribal conflict in Australia, I think it was, the procedure is regulated by a recognized body of customs which is equivalent to the international law of modern nations. You know, this is where it all starts, I think. And the idea of, you know, let there be collective reciprocation / retribution, you know, has positive as well as negative implications. It gets you to a version of the just war theory, which Kelsen was quite attached to. Actually, it also gets you, I think, to pacta sunt servanda, the idea that, you know, whatever is done to us by them, let us do it to them. What, you know, if they're making a treaty with us, let us ensure we also observe it. You know, so I think, you know, this detour through the idea of the primitive does get us to something quite fundamental about international law. So, yeah, I think international law, in all its vast diversity, in all its unfathomable extension over time, can be considered as a legal system in the Kelsenian sense, if we define system, the word system appropriately. Roughly speaking, as an assemblage of practices, I'm sorry for reading my slide, but I've got a definition here, as an assemblage of practices with a common logic in a defined community. And in response to one of the speakers yesterday, I believe we can rehabilitate Kelsenian monism. And you know, if we sort of refocus our lens on, you know, systems seen in this broader sense, we can rehabilitate Kelsenian monism as an explanatory approach, which helps us make sense of the world of multiple loosely defined systems in which we live, and the multi-tiered world of multiple legal systems which constitutes universal law. That's the main argument. I was a brief postscript about the broader uses of the notion of primitive. So Society and Nature, which, as I say, is quite an eccentric work, identifies this notion of retributivism as the origin of our scientific concept of causality. And it goes on to say that this rigid notion, this rigid sort of billiard balls on a table kind of notion of causality, effect X always follows cause Y. This rigid notion of causality has been effectively debunked, disproved by Hume, reconceptualized by Kant as a transcendental category, as a mode of thought rather than a statement about how things are in the real world, and for practical scientific purposes supplanted by a notion of statistical probability and, you know, interdependencies within broader systems and so forth. Now, if science has outgrown the notion of rigid causality, which grew from primitive retributivism, maybe society has also outgrown retribution. And then you have this bizarre passage, which I'll just leave up there for a few seconds. So Kelsen's saying, if we abandon the ideology of retribution, based on this idea of substantializing, the idea of wrong and punishment as substances that can be sort of, you trade the wrong of the crime for the equal amount of wrong of punishment. We abandon the ideology of retribution and we accept prevention as the purpose of punishment, then the equivalence of wrong and punishment loses its sense. And the theory of prevention, of crime prevention, of replacing retributivism as the sort of core principle of criminal law with ideas of deterrence and crime prevention, and, you know, what's been called reductivism by some authors. The theory of prevention in juristic thinking represents a triumph over the principle of retribution. This is quite bizarre. Kelsen admittedly associates the primitive with lack of ego, with you know, collective liability, absolute liability, all these things that we don't by and large do anymore, these things that don't characterize developed legal systems, and of course with self-help, with custom instead of legislation, with vendetta and feud instead of centralized enforcement. But, you know, having said all of that, Kelsen has also fairly strongly associated the notion of the primitive with the retributive principle itself, with the idea of matching a wrong with a retaliative punishment, with the imputation of, he actually uses the word imputation, which is very familiar from his other work, the imputation of guilt rather than identifying causal factors. So, you know, he actually seems to be welcoming the prospects of moving beyond his own theory, where the matching the sanction to the delict is so central. So it seems that in I suppose we must date this work back to 1940. I think that's when Kelsen wrote Vergeltung und Kausalität, and later English versions are stepping slightly back, but still very much in the same vein. So in 1940, Kelsen appears to be preparing to undermine his entire system, and you know, it's an interesting question. Sort of, what was he actually up to at this point, and what, if any, were its longer term effects? And yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Professor Lars. We have 33 minutes for questions and comments. Who wants to break the ice? Professor Lars?
So I guess I have a question for Phil Edwards. So I guess it's just a question of clarification. So can you say more about why the rejection of the retributive principle as primitive introduces an inconsistency in Kelsen's theory? I'm not quite sure I see why.
Well, he rejects in Society and Nature. He rejects the retributive principle because it's based on substantializing, because it's based on this idea of matching, matching the wrong done with the punishment inflicted, and you know, it seems to me that's perhaps it's a bit of a leap, but it seems to me that is very strongly recalls the matching of sanction to delict. That you know, if you've said that
Right.
you know, we're not going to match the punishment to the wrong, isn't that saying we're not going to match the sanction to the delict?
Right, but I mean, couldn't you say that? Or wouldn't Kelsen say perhaps that the delict is in the legal theory, it's a technical term. It's just the term you use to refer to the action or the event that is the condition for the application of a sanction. And so I guess you might have the view, if you're a legal moralist, that the appropriate way to use the law, the coercive force of the law, is to impose sanctions on actions that we think make someone morally deserving of punishment or guilty. But I think Kelsen has the view that this is a primitive way of thinking of legal technique. So what you have to realize, I think, according to Kelsen, is that the technique of imposing a sanction on a certain behavior can be used for, well, any kind of purpose, really, that you might think could usefully be pursued by the use of coercive force. And it seems to me that what he thinks is primitive about moralizing the idea of imputation by referring to the retributive principle is that it tends to occlude or to conceal the ways in which the law as a technique might be used. And the clearer we have a consciousness of that, the more likely it is, I suppose, for someone like Kelsen, that the way in which we use the law will indeed be, well, serviceable to whatever purposes we might decide as a community we have. And so this openness or contingency, I suppose, is something that he thinks will be concealed by too moralistic a reading of the technical relation between delict and sanction, or the technical understanding of imputation. And I mean, in a sense, that's what the purity of a positivist theory is about, right? It's supposed to free our thinking about the law from moralistic assumptions, and thus give us a better sense of what can actually be done with the law.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose my sense of it is that you know, as soon as you move from retribution into prevention, you're getting in, well, essentially getting into politics. You know, that there are any number of things that can be done in society to reduce the overall level of crime, and you know, not all of them have any connection at all to excuse me, not all of them have any connection at all to you know, an identifiable responding in any way to a particular act.
Thank you very much, Jorge.
Yes, just to follow, I have a question for Jingshu, but I'll ask that later, because just to follow Lars, I'm a bit intrigued, Phil, about exactly the same point, because Kelsen is clear, again, his epistemological claim, not ontological. You know, with sanction, he distinguishes between positive and negative sanctions. When we had the Force of Law, the book, a few years ago, and we had the opportunity with Lars, with the presentation in Ankara, you know, the carrot and the stick, let's put the metaphor. Although it's true, Kelsen uses mainly negative sanctions as examples. So that's why I'm a bit, you know, I'm in a bit of puzzle with, you know, this take on retribution. And the other comment, and it may be my reading, and I may have to read again Society and Nature there. But I don't remember Kelsen, and again, I read it many years ago, so you know, I will have to visit the book again. I don't remember Kelsen talking about civilizations, in particular the ones that use causality as savages. Why I say this? Because I remember, and even me with my mentor, I've been teaching philosophy of law more so in Argentina for 25 years. And I remember my mentor, I was a junior, I was still doing my degree at the time. And I remember she would have put, using Kelsen as well, but she would have adapted to current example. In Latin America, we have some civilizations and they still believe in animism. So she didn't need to go, you know, a few years back, you know, she was using current examples. And even me, you know, I still believe in Pachamama. I mean, an example is the Pope, you know, very controversial. The Pope uses Pachamama because he's Argentinian and from Latin America, together with God, you know, Mother Earth is Pachamama. So it may be cultural, but I don't remember that reading from Kelsen or that interpretation, you know, him labeling or talking derogatively. I think he was mainly describing, using that as an example, causality, and some people see retribution as a positive, let's say the sun and the rain, and then I'm going to have my crops, you know, that's a positive sanction. And then the negative sanction, something being taken from. And in that sense, you know, that was my reading many years ago about society and nature. So again, the comment about retribution, the other, the question about society and nature. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, I think actually your comment kind of answers your question, because the key point of the retributive principle is that either, you know, that either good or bad is matched with something. You know, the key point is the repayment of good for good or bad for bad. So yeah, you know, it is the case that a sanction isn't necessarily a negative thing, but you know that could fit into the retributive principle more broadly considered. Yeah, Kelsen doesn't describe the people he's talking about as idiots. That was a rather hostile summary. Having said that, he does say that the quote primitive people he's talking about literally have no conception of causality. I mean, you know, literally, and there are sort of arguments in his footnotes where he cites people saying, you know, just because people you know carry out these sort of ritual practices in response to good fortune and misfortune, that doesn't mean they actually don't know about causality. And Kelsen sort of argues back and said, yes, it does. You know, there's one odd passage where he's talking about how primitive people have no idea about sexual reproduction. They primitive people genuinely believe that a woman has a child when a soul of an ancestor wants to be reincarnated, and that's the only thing that matters. And again, in a note, he cites someone as saying that you know, this particular ethnographer had talked to some tribal elders and said, you know, what about sexual intercourse? Doesn't that play a role? And the tribal elders said, well, yes, of course, everyone knows that, you know. And but Kelsen says, oh, well, these people had obviously been talking to Westerners, you know, that's the only place they could have got that idea. So I think, you know, it's sort of Kelsenian tendency to, you know, perhaps not consider nuances when they're not convenient to his argument. I think he does tend to paint with a very broad brush, and that's what makes it quite a problematic work these days, I think.
Jingshu? Jorge, did you ask Jingshu? Because you
Oh, sorry, no, sorry. You were talking to Jingshu, just because again, Lars hit the spot earlier, and probably the first time I hear someone acknowledging that Kelsen uses different hats: a legal philosopher, a political scientist, an anthropologist, and many others. So. You know, I see as well in your paper or presentation, Jingshu, probably a bit unclear because you mainly mention the let's say the logical side, you know, the relationship between international law and national legal systems. But I was thinking, and I'm going to have to ask you this question because I do know you work in China and your research, you're doing your research in China. So I have to ask you, you know, that question: how can you reconcile, you know, Kelsen's understanding and your own, you know, understanding about how to solve conflicts in law between international and national law, and the Chinese take on international law? And I'm thinking about Taiwan, I'm thinking about Hong Kong, I'm thinking about the Southeast Chinese Sea. So again, how can you reconcile, you know, the law in China in relation to international law? Regardless of the examples, I'm putting examples, you know, just you know, to illustrate. Your mic.
You're muted.
Yeah. So the question is, you want me to give an example of how to solve the conflict of norms between the different district
I don't know if because it will be, you know, even me, I don't have the answer. So so it's not, I don't want you to put you in the spot. No, but I'm intrigued because it's a pleasure to have a colleague from China. So, you know, and a pleasure to have the opportunity to ask this question, because China is a very unique legal system, both, you know, logically and then in experience, you know. so it's a particular, and we use that example when we teach public international law, and how they may use international law when it's convenient to and when they may not. So that's why I was talking about the different hats, because there may be no question related to legal theory per se, but more of a political science question. So I don't know if you have an answer, what do we do with China? Because China is part of the rest of the global, or what I call the universal law.
Yeah, so China also, of course, China is a party of many international law, and the style, or how Chinese Chinese court apply international law is do not have a conclusion in legal theory in China, but we have some certain techniques to solve the conflict between different legal district within China, such as the Hong Kong law, the mainland Chinese law, and the law of Macau. Yeah, so it's not a conflict of international law, but it's a conflict between norm. It may happens that there conflict between the norms of different district of legal system within China. So the technique is we create certain rules or principles inside domestic law of China to solve the most possibly disputes inside the legal system, and also in some area of law, like the contract law. So for now is the contract part inside inside the civil code. There are certain rules to accept a caution or accept some content of international law inside our domestic law to and it also give a choice for civil parties when they build a contract. They can choose which certain rules they want to apply inside the contract. So that's maybe some possible techniques to resolve the conflict between norms. Yeah.
Professor Lars?
Yes, so I guess this perhaps goes to the answer that you gave. So one thing that's quite strange, I find personally, about or difficult to wrap one's head around about what Kelsen has to say about monism, is that he thinks that there are these two different versions of monism. So I guess you could be a cosmopolitan monist who takes it that that there's an international legal system and all the national legal systems are parts of that. But you could also be a national monist, right? So you could say that international law is valid because to the extent that it has been incorporated into the law of your own national system, and that makes international norms validated to the extent that you think they are valid by your own national system's basic norm. And of course, it seems intuitively that how you look at norm conflicts of the sort that Jorge described depends on which of these two perspectives you take, perhaps in some cases. And Kelsen himself, he says that, well, again, scientifically, that there is no that there is no pressing reason to be a cosmopolitan monist, right? So scientifically, national monism is as respectable. So perhaps someone may think morally it is not as respectable, but that's not a scientific or legal scientific view anymore. And so it seems that if you take that seriously, this rather strange sequence of claims, then in the end, at least as long as you stay on the level of legal theory, the monist view may tell you much less about how certain conflicts are to be settled than you might assume at first glance when you start out from this very strong monist claim, apparently, that all legal norms form part of the same system and that all conflicts can be resolved by interpretation. And so I guess perhaps the question is, so how much does monism really contribute to solving actual conflicts, or is it just a kind of intellectual game that Kelsen is playing?
Yeah, and I understand your question. Also, so the effect, so it's another express of the question that how do you see the effectiveness of international law can be applied inside a certain state or certain domestic legal system. So that's I think that's a different level of question, like whether the monism is logically correct, or whether in a real world the monism have already been a actual truth. So I think, in my opinion, monism is firstly a theoretical construction, and we can use it as a way to understand that there is a chance that we can solve conflict of norms between domestic law and international law, and those theory mainly based on domestic law, the legal theory can be applied to solve these problems. On the other side, if I am a local court, a court of a certain state, the difficult to apply an international law directly in a certain case still exists, and it depends on how developed the states to, and the style the state adapt to the international law. So can I answer your question?
Yeah, yes, thanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
More questions or comments?
No, but very briefly, Gonzalo, just a comment. Interesting, this, dialogue between Lars and Jingshu, because I think they clearly, kind of, Lars said, intellectual game. As long as, as an author, a scholar, we explain our readers or, our audience where we are coming from. And I think, again, I'm not trying to defend Kelsen, but I think Kelsen is very clear. His claim is epistemological, like unity, to put an example. And that's why, as Lars and again Jesus were talking, whether national law is superior, international law is superior, whether we have universal law, we are playing an intellectual game. In fact, that's how we started with Veronica. We used a different term at the time, Juris North. We were going to play an intellectual game. We use another expression. I cannot share. But anyway, what I'm trying to suggest is, as long as the problem is, of course, will be limited as a scholar, and we are limiting, the criticism as well. It may be unfair. However, the pro is, if you want to play with me, I'm setting the rules. And I think Kelsen is pretty clear about it. Again, I'm not defending him. I'm just trying to, and I'm not trying to convince, I'm just trying to explain. And coming back to, it's a coincidence, but it's not because we planned this, you know, a month in advance. Dr. Zaleska will come later to talk about fictions. We have her presentation back in May. And Dr. Zaleska deals with this particular issue, you know, this fictional world Kelsen created. So thank you very much for you know, for this dialogue.
And I want to comment add to that, for example, many constitutions in Latin America, the Colombian constitution is one example of that, introduce a block of constitutionality. That is, the presuppositions that the international law has priority over the national law. And that is a claim of monism. So there are more comments or questions here, or we can close, I think. And we start the break.
If you want, we can have a 40-minute break rather than 30. Yeah, that will be fine. Unless we have any final comments or questions.
Cristiano Moita?
There's just a random comment. Well, Jorge made a very interesting comment about it, and I don't think that's what I've written. I don't think it is the right moment to discuss it, but it would be very interesting to explore at some other opportunity the distinction between epistemological attitudes from political attitudes, because I do believe that to a certain degree, explicit epistemological attitudes, such as what underline what Kelsen did, is to some extent to adopt value committed attitudes, or but I really don't think that is the moment. It is just a random comment to the beautiful follow-up comment on the beautiful comment made by Jorge. So that's it.
What you call political, I think Kelsen calls axiological, and the doctrine of sovereignty, which has to do with this monism and whether international law is superior or national, and that's the reason I claim Kelsen was against sovereignty, not because he was against the concept itself, you know, he was a philosopher above everything else, but politically, you know, it's an axiological choice to decide whether a state, a legal system, is absolute or limited. So yeah, it's an interesting discussion, Cristiano.
Yeah.
Sorry, Edwards?
Yeah. I just want to say that distinction between the epistemological and the political or axiological was very much what I was getting at with my paper. That you know, Kelsen's envisaging of international law as a system, as you know, confused some people because they take it as necessarily being you know, embodying a political commitment. That said, you know, there is a question whether even thinking international law systematically in that purely epistemological approach, whether even that embodies some political commitment, and you know, which Kelsen of course disclaimed, but you know, I think it's still an open question, and as you say, quite a big one, which we can probably discuss another time.
So anyone else, or maybe we go to the break? Jorge, if you want to close.
Yes, thank you very much. Lars Vinx, or Professor Lars Vinx, thank you very much. A pleasure to have you here. We met many years ago because of Shower, actually, you know, the force of law. So we talk about this physical coercion, rational coercion, psychological coercion. And thank you very much, and for, you know, being part of the project as well with Hard Publishing. I don't know if you want, Lars, to say anything.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thanks for the invitation, and I hope we'll meet again very soon. Talk more about some of the open threads that were left.
No. We'll keep on playing this intellectual game. Jingshu from China, because we are conscious about the time difference. So xie. And in particular to Phil Edwards, or Dr. Phil Edwards, because he's been with Juris probably since the start, if not from the very first meeting face-to-face, probably the second author. So he's been with Juris Notes for probably 7 years now. So hats off
7
to
years.
Phil Edwards on behalf of all the Juris Notes team, Veronica, Willie at Durham, Mike because he's been to one of the many stories I can recall with Phil. We went together to see William Lucy's presentation, one of our chairs. He was presenting at the Liverpool School of Law. And Phil has been all over the place with us. So thank you very much, all three, and my co-host Gonzalo. We'll reconvene in 35 minutes. Oh, we're on time. 35 minutes. And we'll have Dr. Monica Zalewska talking about Kelsen and fictions. Thank you all, and I'm going to stop the recording any second. And if you want to put the music, Gonzalo, feel free to do it.